We're going to start off with a little bit of the Kuzari. I mentioned to you last week that in our discussion of Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, it's very esoteric, mystical information. So we're not going to be able to go through it all sequentially because we're just going to get really bogged in the mire of Kabbalah. And I'd rather avoid that if we can. So last week we jumped to subparagraph 30. That's on page 466 in the Feldheim edition. And essentially, we showed you a chart last week which breaks down all of reality into three parts. Does anyone remember the names of those three parts? The chart is on page 458, 459, 460. All of reality can be broken down into Olam, Nefesh, and Shana. Olam, Nefesh, Shana, which are code words for space, soul, and time. So the universe writ large basically has corresponding coordinates in all three of these realms. Space and time are clearly connected with each other, and they're mapped on coordinates, like an XY coordinate, Cartesian mathematics, Cartesian geography, the XY axis, you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so time and space are plotted, right? So right now, we are in a specific time and in a specific place along a continuum, right? And every time you move and every time time flows, that moves forward or backward. We just need everyone to please, as always, we ask everyone to please mute yourselves. Okay, I'm just going to mute all. There we go. There's an X, there's a Y, and then there's a Z coordinate or a Z coordinate, and that's the human soul. And that's something that the Sefer Yetzirah introduces, is that the human experience is also plotted along this three axis set of coordinates. And it turns out that everything that Hashem created, not only does it have its parallel in one of those three realms, but there is essentially no difference in the emanation from Hashem that flows into any one of those three axes, which means that when we look at the universe writ large, there really is no difference between a planet or a celestial body and an ant that crawls on the ground. They are all experiencing, or they all are a product of the same divine emanation. One is not less and one is not more. They are all the same. From this perspective of the Sefer Yetzirah, the only difference is the nature of the material that God employs when he chooses his divine overflow. Okay? And just let him know that we've got a class going on. Okay. So, right, he wasn't aware. That's okay. Yeah, right. So, the only reason, and that's where we start on the top of page 466. The only reason the celestial bodies are loftier is because they are made of purer matter, which because of its purity lasts longer. Thus, only God himself can destroy these bodies. These bodies don't destroy themselves. Now, of course, this may not be in sync with modern science, because modern science believes that all material things are finite in nature. Even the sun is supposed to run out of energy in about 4 billion years. So you better do your shopping now, because you may run out of time. But the point is that from the perspective of Sefer Yetzirah, there are certain emanations of God which have a sense of permanence, and others which are extremely transitory. But it's not because they essentially differ in the amount of godliness that is infused in them, but rather because of the matter or the material that God used to bond his essence with these things. Living creatures, and by the way, all of this terminology is a bit mysterious for us. but we're going to go with it anyway. Living creatures, on the other hand, are composed of matter that receives ever-changing forms. And it is one of the principles of Sefer Yetzirah that of the physical realm, there are two completely different realms that differ in the matter, the material that is employed to make up these two realms. Unlike modern science, where the same periodic table is applicable on the planet Jupiter as it is on the planet Earth, from the perspective of Sefer Yetzirah, and for that matter, all medieval writing, both secular and Jewish, there's a completely different material above our planet from the material that is within what's called the lunar sphere. The lunar sphere is the innermost sphere that envelops our planet with the orbit of the planet moon, of the moon. Sorry. Yeah.
Forgive me for such limited knowledge that I can actually give over. But Hashem created different days, different days, and different emanations in each day, and celestial bodies has its own. Like we know it's different. It was created on a different day or a different time.
Yeah. Well, we have traditionally 7 celestial trajectories of the different planets, and we also have 7 days of the week. Again, that's the same correspondence. Okay, in the classical texts. It is continually introduced to opposing forces such as cold and heat. Because the material of our planet is constantly subjected to opposing forces, things going on in our own bodies, which are constantly rubbing against each other or chafing, or if I could ask everyone to please, again, silence your phones. Again, so there are constant bodies that materials in our own bodies and in the world around us. That's okay. That are constantly struggling with each other, pushing against each other, right? And as a result, things eventually wear down. It's basically like, just like your washing machine eventually has to be replaced because there's so many moving parts. The same thing exists in every natural phenomenon in this world as well. All we do as human beings is do our best to imitate the machines that God created in this world, including the human body. And we're actually moving further and further along in this effort, although we still have a huge way to go. We're just now starting with robots, right? But the advancements that we're making are all just to imitate the way that nature works. But you see that everything eventually breaks down. And that's why things die. And as a result, time would therefore completely destroy these creatures, were it not for the divine wisdom which was implemented to create them as male and female. What does God do? He creates a world that, even though every material construct breaks down, but every material construct also has the ability to reproduce itself, at least among organic material. In this way, the species perpetuates even though the individual creatures die. And that's throughout the plant world, it's throughout the animal world. And that's how creatures and objects that were created by God that naturally break down and die replenish themselves through procreation. That's true among plants, and it's true among all living creatures. This wisdom was implemented through the orbit of the sun, its rising and setting, as noted in Sefer Yetzirah. It is through the sun's rotations that differences between males and females come into being. And really, it's not the sun. I just translated it as the sun for simplistic reasons. It's the motion of the celestial spheres, which is a medieval term, but it's the same idea. It's the term, the Hebrew word is galgal. Okay, but just to keep it simple, the motions of the celestial bodies cause certain things to be born male and certain things to be born female, but it's indiscriminate. The author thus stated that there is no difference between the formations of the male and the female, except for the visibility of some organs in the one and the concealment of some in the other. Let's make sure we understand that. The male and female both in animals and in human beings, are actually inversions of each other when we talk about the reproductive organs. The male organs are pushed out of the body, and the female organs are pushed into the body, but they're essentially the same. This is anatomically accurate because this was already known in the medieval world, that to a certain degree, the female has vestiges of testes, and the male has a vestige of the female organ. It's just that when and this is why we sometimes get congenital abnormalities, because the hormones in some way are suppressed in utero, and therefore, even though a child was supposed to gestate and turn male, that gestation process for that hormonal process in some way was interrupted or retarded. And it turns out that he's anatomically female, or in some way, something happens that it comes out ambiguous. So it's a rarity, but that's essentially what happens. If you speak to someone who's, let's say, a urologist or a gynecologist, they will explain these principles to you, that every embryo and the early fetus is female. And through the introduction of the XY chromosome and the hormones that are secreted, the fetus develops male genitalia. And if that process is in any way impeded, it remains a female. Okay. So, and that's why sometimes you can actually have a condition where a baby is born with the XY chromosome, but because something went wrong in utero, the baby manifests as a female, and therefore they're born without a uterus, but they still are anatomically female. The Gemara says that that's what's happened with Sarah. Sarah was what's called an Ilonit, and she didn't have a uterus. And that only amplifies the miracle that happened with Sarah, is that she was able to conceive because God completely reconstructed a uterus for her and implanted it within her, which is uncanny when you think about it. It has already been documented through surgical analysis. Now, he's writing this, remember, in the 12th century. So they already had this medical knowledge way back then, close to 1,000 years ago, that the female organs are the same as the male organs, except that in the female, they are inverted inwards. Now, the truth be told, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi doesn't completely explain, even though he's quoting the Sefer Yetzirah, he doesn't completely explain why God made a reproductive system where some creatures are male and some creatures are female. After all, you could present a challenge that why not say that all species who grow and then eventually wear down and die should be able to be self-reproducing. Was that called autonomous or reproduction? You know, there are certain animals that are like that. I think that, you know,
Is that asexual?
I'm not sure if it's asexual or bisexual. I'm not sure what it would be called, but it is possible for certain, like, I think they say, well, first of all, simple living structures like cells simply divide. So why couldn't human beings, when it was time to reproduce, simply divide instead of having to do this reproductive process where there are some humans that are male and some humans that are female? Is that the only way that human beings can replace themselves? Now, of course, you know, these kinds of what-if experiments aren't always productive because we don't know what would have been if everyone was self-reproductive, right? But for some reason, God in his wisdom felt that this was the best way for both animals and humans and plants, because you have male and female plants as well. You have the stamen and the, what's the other one? The pistil and the stamen, right? And some are male, some plants are, some trees are male, some trees are female. It's the same thing in the plant world. And why it has to be that way, it seems that there needs to be the introduction of two different kinds of bodies to combine with each other in order to create a successful reproduction. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work in the way that God introduced matter into this world. And it's a mystery that we can conjecture the reasons for it, perhaps on an ethical level, like on a Musar level or philosophical level, that God wanted there to be the need for a human being to find someone outside of himself that is sufficiently different from himself to remind himself that he's not God. Okay, there could be that kind of lesson involved, but from a purely scientific point of view, I'm not sure that we could. I don't possess the knowledge to really answer that question. So Karen asks, Adam and Chava were created as one conjoined unit. So how would reproduction have worked for them? You're right. The way that God originally created them, they wouldn't have had the ability to reproduce. I guess the original plan was to create them as one unitary being and then to separate them afterwards. But it was to demonstrate that the optimal state of the human being is to be conjoined as completely as possible with his mate, and only because it's necessary for reproductive purposes and perhaps for psychological purposes as well, for two human beings to comprise one unit that are separate, that God later separated them. Remember, God is unitary, so anything that emanates from God has to be unitary in some way also. And that's the message, the way our sages explain it, why God created man as a unitary being to resemble God, B'Tselem Elokim, and then divided that initial construct into male and female. Okay, so let me just see if there's, so Sefer Yetzirah, just to continue this statement, Sefer Yetzirah thus states, the male is created with Aleph Mem Shin. If you remember, the three letters Aleph Mem Shin are the three mother letters, the three letters that represent the all-encompassing three letters that God used to emanate all of the additional letters. And the female is created with Aleph Shin Mem. So, you see, what's interesting is that what Sefer Yetzirah is alluding to is that they're essentially the same being, but just one is inverted from the other, just like the letters Shin and Mem are transposed. Okay? The celestial sphere rotates forwards and backwards. There is nothing better than pleasure. What is the word for pleasure? Oneg. How do you spell oneg? Ayin Nun Gimel. And there is nothing worse than a wound, which is nega. Nega is just to jumble the letters of oneg and to turn it into nega. So you see how easy it is for things to be turned around and inverted, where oneg can become nega, nega can become oneg. They are really all emanating from the same source, and human beings perceive one thing to be oneg and another thing to be a nega when they are all coming from the same source. This means that the letters Aleph Mem Shin and Aleph Shin Mem are the same, just like the letters of the words oneg and nega are the same. The only difference between each set is the sequence of the letters. Similarly, the rising and setting of the celestial sphere is all the same from the sphere's perspective, but from our perspective, the sphere appears to change between going out at rising and coming back at setting. Okay, so we perceive things as being multitudinous and varied, but from the perspective of God and the heavenly bodies, everything is all the same. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that the more you pull away from our perspective. You remember that video where the camera lens pulls away from this woman who's lying on the grass? Forget what that's called, that video. I talked about it before. First, it goes all the way into the pupil of her eye and goes deeper and deeper and deeper and finds the cells and then the molecules of the cells and then the atoms of the molecules and then the subatomic particles, deep, more and more and more magnified and like to the millionth degree. And then it pulls out the camera, so to speak, this generated video, and it goes above the planet Earth, then above the moon, then above our solar system, then above our galaxy, then above 10 galaxies, and then until you're at the very edge of the universe, 15 billion light years away, right? And when you take that kind of global perspective, everything looks or appears unitary, because everything is unitary. It's all a question of perspective. So that's where I'd like to hold it for today. Oh, by the way, I just want to let you know when we get to the end of this section, which we probably will in about 2 or 3 weeks, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to ask a very familiar question. And the question that he's going to ask is, this is all fascinating, this information in Sefer Yetzirah, but why is it necessary? Why do we need it at all? Sounds like a familiar question, doesn't it? Like, why do we need it at all? I mean, isn't it just enough to know that God created the world and he gave us the Torah and he chose Avraham Avinu, and that's all we need to know? And actually, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to acknowledge the validity of that kind of thinking. For now, he feels that he must respond to the philosopher who is seeking answers and an alternate explanation to this, all of reality that God created. But at some point, he's going to at least acknowledge that, if you really wish to live your life with the Masorah that God gave us, and you don't feel a need to delve into these esoteric concepts, that's also okay. Okay, let's go on. Let's go on to the Parsha. Okay. Want to point out something quite interesting. At the very beginning of the Parsha, we find that Avraham buries Sarah in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron. Sarah passes away, and Avraham goes to bury her. Where was Avraham at this time when Sarah died? Can anyone tell me? When Sarah passed away, where was Avraham? At the Akedah. That's what we're used to thinking based on the Rashi. So let's take a look at the psukim. The last pasuk of the story of the Akedah from last week's parsha is Vayoshav Avraham el Ne'arav. Avraham returned to his youth. The two young men who were there, Yishmael and Eliezer. Vayakumu vayelechu yachdav el Be'er Sheva. And they traveled together to Be'er Sheva. Vayeshav Avraham Be'er Sheva. And Avraham was living in Be'er Sheva. Now, the Torah tells us at the beginning of our parsha, Vatamot Sarah b'Kiryat Arba hi Chevron be'Eretz Canaan. That Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is another name for Chevron, in the land of Canaan, in Eretz Yisrael. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'sarav v'livkota. Avraham has to come to eulogize and to cry over Sarah. So where was Avraham coming from? Rashi says, Vayavo Avraham mi Be'er Sheva. If at the end of the Akedah, he traveled to Be'er Sheva, then he must have traveled from Be'er Sheva to come to eulogize Sarah. And lispod l'sarav v'livkota, to eulogize Sarah. And Rashi then says, V'nismecha mitat Sarah la'akedat Yitzchak. Sarah's death was placed adjacent to the story of the Akedah, Lefisha al yedei besurata Akedah shenizdamin bina lishchita, that through the tiding of the Akedah, that her son had been prepared for slaughter, the kimat shelo nishchat, and that he was almost slaughtered, parcha nishmata mimena vameta. Her soul departed from her and she died. So Rashi tells us at the same time that we know that Sarah died shortly after the Akedah, that Avraham, when he came to Sarah to eulogize her and to bury her, he was in Be'er Sheva. Now, I don't know about you, but if my wife and I live in 2 separate cities, what does that say about the marriage? What was Sarah doing in Hebron? If she died there, what does it say about their marriage? If she died in Hebron, what was Avram doing in Be'er Sheva? And if he lived in Be'er Sheva, which seems to be what the verses say even before the Akedah, that Avraham was in Be'er Sheva, that's where he made the treaty with the Philistine king Avimelech. why is Sarah dying in Hebron? Why is that? Okay. So how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of this? Does anyone have a theory? Can you want to offer a theory? Why Sarah was in Hebron?
Well, there's an assumption made that Sarah died right after the Akedah, but we don't know that.
We don't know that, but even if she didn't die after the Akedah, why would she be in Hebron if her husband was in Beersheba?
Well,
By the way,
maybe Abraham moved to Hebron. Is that
what?
possible? Could Abraham have both of them have moved to Hebron after the Akedah?
They both moved to Hebron, you want to say, Elaine?
Yeah, is that possible?
I guess you could say it's possible. That's one of the things that the commentaries suggest, is that even though it says that Avraham lived in Beersheba, they temporarily relocated to Hebron. And then after Sarah died, Avraham went back to Beersheba. But why? Like, what's the significance? And why explain this to me in that way? I can understand transporting Sarah to Hebron to bury her there because that's the place designated as the Ma'aras HaMachpelah and the place where the holy patriarchs are meant to be buried. That's where Adam and Chava are buried. So I can certainly understand if Sarah had died in Beersheba and then her body was transported. The Torah tells us that in the story of the Akedah, Vayihi Bayom HaShalishi, on the third day of Avram and Yitzchak traveling, they finally get to the place of the Akedah, which is Mount Moriah right outside Jerusalem. Now, if Avram was in Beersheba, that would make sense. So it seems like Avram was in Beersheba even before the Akedah. It says he goes back to Beersheba. So again, the idea that Sarah has to die in Hebron is somewhat mysterious. Okay, so let's try and make sense of this. There's some Torah from Reb Tzadok HaKohen, Rabinowitz, who lived in the early 19th century, which is extremely esoteric, very profound. It's Chassidus. But we're going to try and distill it using a more modern sefer called Sefer Ma'or Tzadik from Reb Chaim Hirsch, who tries to just distill the ideas. Okay? So
Sorry, Rabbi, is it
yes,
possible to make it a little bit bigger?
to make it a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to try to do that. How's that? Let me just see. I'll zoom in.
If possible.
Does that make it better?
Yeah, it's a little bit better. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. Does that make it a little bit better for our audience here? Okay. Do you want me to make it bigger?
If possible.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, perfect now. Yeah,
Okay.
good.
Is that better? Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
So the question is, Mehichan Avraham. Where did Avraham come from to bury Sarah? Pirish Rashi mi Be'er-Sheva. He came from Be'er-Sheva. De'a acheret nimtzeit b'midrash. There's another opinion in the Medrash, Shemehar HaMoriah ba'Avraham, that immediately after the Akedah, he was still on Mount Moriah, and he took a beeline to Hebron. Kevin shebiglal hashmua al Akedah parcha nishmata shel Sarah. That because immediately after the Akedah, Sarah died, it was through her hearing about the Akedah that she died. Now, Maksheh HaRamban, I didn't bring the actual original text of the Ramban because it's a little bit lengthy, so he boils it down for us. Im Avraham gar be'er-sheva, ketzad niftara Sarah b'Chevron. If Avram was living in Beersheba, how could Sarah die in Hebron? It's not like she went to the mall, and got in her car and drove from Beersheba to Hebron. That you could do today, but it's a 3-day journey on a camel to go from Beersheba to Hebron. So what was Sarah doing there? Shaharei mikan mashma shebechevron gar Avraham. It sounds like if Sarah died in Hebron, that Avram must have been there as well, because that's what husbands and wives do. They hang out with each other. Umiyashev HaRamban, shelefi midrash Sarah niftara be'eta akedah. So if we're going to understand that Sarah died shortly after the Akedah, tzarech lomar ki Avraham v'Sarah bizman ha'akedah hayu garim bechevron. You have to say that they were both living in Hebron at the time, okay? Ve'Avraham achar ha'akedah Lo shavli makamo b'Chevron. And right after the Akedah, Avraham decided to leave Sarah in Hebron, where they had an apartment, and he went temporarily to Be'er Sheva. אבל הלך תחילה לבאר שבע, מקום האשל שלו, לתת הודעה על ניסו. He went to Beersheba. Why is Beersheba so significant to Avraham? He makes a treaty with Avimelech. He lives in peace there. It represents God's sheltering presence, his protection. And remember, Avraham planted what's called an eshel, which they translate as some kind of tree, which represents his appreciation to Hashem for having protected him from his enemies. So that's where he goes to, let's say, bow down in front of that tree to give thanks to Hashem. This is like a place that I'm familiar with. Let's say, for example, people today travel to Europe to go to Kever Avos, and they'll go to the burial places of holy people. There's a significance to that because it sort of connects you with your history. And especially if Avram's history was in Beersheba, he wanted to give thanks to Hashem there for sparing his son Yitzchak and being with him at all times. V'sham shama b'mitat Sarah uba. And therefore, he heard about Sarah's death when he was in Beersheba, and therefore he quickly rushed back to Hebron. Umasha katuv vayeshav Avram b'Beersheba shu lashon yeshivat keva, but that's problematic because at the end of the Akedah it says that Avraham dwelled in Beersheba. It doesn't say he visited Beersheba. It says he dwelled in Beersheba. So he says, "V'lo lebikur shel mispar hayah davar achar mitat Sarah ukvarata." You have to say that what it means is that after Sarah died and he buried her, he went back to live in Beersheba. In other words, maybe Sarah sort of basically told Avraham after they were living in Beersheba for a number of years, it's too hot in Beersheba. There's no AC. We're living 3,000 years before they're going to invent the air conditioner. What are civilized human beings doing in a desert like Beersheba? Let's move up to a more temperate climate. Let's go to Hebron. So Avram said, okay, it's a good request. They moved to Hebron. But once Sarah passed away, Avram said, my heart is in Beersheba. And so he moved back down to Beersheba after Sarah died and she was buried. So he says, that's the way the Ramban understands the sequence of events. Now let's go on. Tzarich lehavin, but let's ask the bigger question. Ma mashma'ut shel yeshivat Avram b'Beersheva l'umat yeshivato b'Chevron? Like, of what significance is this? Who cares where he lived, right? Whether he lived in Beersheba, whether he lived in Hebron, does it really make a difference? Umadua nikshar hadavar b'Parshata Akedah. And why is this discussion of where Avraham was living and where Sarah died all attached to the story of the Akedah? Kidei la'anot al kach yesh levarer ma inyanam shel kol echad shegimel hamikamot Yerushalayim, Hebron, uBe'er Sheva. We have to understand the significance of Yerushalayim, Hebron, and Beersheba. We're going to focus mostly on Hebron and Beersheba for our purposes for today, because Hebron, for all intents and purposes, is really Jerusalem adjacent. For those of you who have driven to Hebron from Jerusalem, you know it's not more than a half an hour trip or so. It's just that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to access it because of security issues. But if you were to beeline from Jerusalem to Hebron, it's not more than a half hour trip, okay? So for our purposes, we're going to say that Hebron and Jerusalem are one domain and Be'er Sheva is another domain. I see Linda raised her hand. Go ahead, Linda. Okay, maybe that was a mistake.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah.
So in all these explanations, like, okay, I get it, but how come nobody brings up the point of, like, why was Yitzchak with him? Like, why wouldn't Yitzchak have been with, like, I don't know how old he was at that time, young. Wouldn't he have been with Sarah? Like, why would, in all these, they don't really mention why Yitzchak always seems to be with Abraham in all of these.
Well, where was, let's assume for a moment that Avram and Sarah are living together. Okay.
Yeah, if they're living together, what about the other where they say, he was in Beersheba and she was there? I mean, why would Yitzchak have been even with him?
Right. So you have to say that Avraham and Sarah were together. Otherwise, the story doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Either they were temporarily in Hebron together, or maybe there's one opinion that says that Avraham, knowing when he was in Beersheba, knew that he needed to get Sarah out of the way when he would take Yitzchak for the Akedah. So he sent her on an excursion to Hebron. That's another explanation. Sarah, you have friends in Hebron. Go visit your friends for a few days. Yitzchak and I are going to go on a camping trip, and you'll go, and we'll have a good time, us boys, and we'll see you when we all get back. That's another way of understanding the story. But somehow you have to explain how Sarah ended up dying in Hebron if Avraham was in Beersheba. So that's all of these creative answers. So the answer is that Yitzchak was with Avraham, either because they were living together, and Avraham took Yitzchak and basically woke up early in the morning when Sarah was still asleep, and just said, Yitzchak, come, we have to go somewhere. I'll show you when we get there. Didn't even tell Sarah. Or maybe he told Sarah that we're going on a trip. Either way, it's not so unusual to explain it. So let's take a look at the words of Reb Tzadok himself, and let's see what he has to say. He says, Be'er Sheva is so called, Hisham Nishbu'u Shenehem. It's called a place of Shavua, of taking an oath. That's what the word Sheva comes from. It also is the number 7, right? Be'er Sheva haya kitzei Eretz Yisrael, kamo shenemar midan va'ad Be'er Sheva. So Reb Tzadok says philosophically that Be'er Sheva represents the southernmost tip, the southernmost extreme of Eretz Yisrael. Now, you and I know that that's not true. We know that Eilat is the southern tip of Israel. But when you look at biblical text, when the rabbis want to describe going from all the most northern territory to the most southern territory, they use the term Midan va'ad Be'er Sheva. From Dan, which is the territory of the tribe of Dan, which was all the way up north in the Galil, all the way down to Be'er Sheva, which is the southernmost. So that means that Be'er Sheva represents one extreme end of Eretz Yisrael. Ki yesh letz upeti. There are 2 types of negative characters that are described in Mishlei. One is called the scoffer, and one is called the fool or the idiot. Shehem shnei ktzavot, kamo sheshamati al drashat Chazal. He says they represent 2 extremes of bad people. Why do they represent 2 extremes? The pasuk in Mishlei says, Leitz takeh upeti yarim. Strike the scoffer and cause the fool to become wise. In other words, shake them up a little bit. These 2 different personalities that have a negative character. And what do these 2 personality types represent? Leitz takeh ze Amalek. The scoffer you have to strike, that represents Amalek, who only knows to be conditioned through violence. Unfortunately, we're seeing Amalek in Gaza today. That's the only language that they understand. But upeti yarim, but sometimes the fool can become wise without violence, ze yitro. That refers to Yisro. Now, Yisro, in a sense, was a heathen. He was a pagan before he met his son-in-law Moshe. And he became wise. That's what we have Parshas Yisro for. Peti ma'amin l'chol davar. So Reb Tzadok explains, do you want to know the difference between a peti and a letz? A peti believes everything and everybody. He says, I believe that there's truth in all religions. I embrace Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. I accept all of them and I embrace everything. And Yitro therefore worshipped every form of idolatry that he could. Umalei avodot l'chol davar. And that's what Yitro's life was really all about. By contrast, the Leitz ein mamin klal ve'eno oved klal. The Letz is just the opposite. The Let says, he's the atheist. He doesn't believe anything. It's all nonsense. Every religion is nonsense. So those are the two personality types that Shlomo HaMelech is describing. Ula olam ha'emtsa'i hu kav hayosher. And what you want to strive for is some median in between the Let's and the Petty. A healthy dose of skepticism with a healthy dose of openness to believing what is logical and makes sense. Okay? And Avol yesh gam katzeh hakadosh. He says, and therefore you have to also appreciate that gam katzeh hakedusha v'li prakim hu tov. There are two extremes that can also be found in the good aspect. The Let's and the Petty are the negative aspect of the extreme. But as we find in Hasidic literature all the time, you can always take something that's Ra and use it for Tov. So you can take this attitude of openness to everything, which is folly, and openness to everything can be converted to something holy as well. And the other extreme of completely shutting down everything and rejecting everything can also be converted to something positive. So Vidan hu lashon avodah zara, kamo shamru b'Shabbat, that when we think about what Shevet Dan represents, the north, that represents avodah zara. It represents Yitro, the openness to trying anything. So he says, V'zehu peti de kedusha, b'makom tzorech avodah kebeit hamikdash. That's, you can convert that openness to everything when you're inside the temple. And you say, I'm ready to do everything that is called upon me to do. And you're completely effusive and embracing of every ritual. Okay? And so that's the how you convert that to something positive. The Let's the Kedusha who be'er Sheva. So what's the Let's attitude? Who completely is opposed to all kinds of effort, to all kinds of embracing. That's be'er Sheva. That's the other extreme. Haromez lemidat Shabbat hamuchuna Sheva ki yadua shehu hamenucha veheder ha'avodah. That's represented by Shabbat. Shabbos is known as the seventh day. So Be'er Sheva represents number 7, which represents the Sabbath. What is Sabbath? Sabbath is desisting from all work. That's what the Let's does. He says, I'm not open to anything. I am closed. I'm shut down. Now, most of the time, shutting yourself off from everything else in the world and not accepting any other belief is a negative attitude. But you can turn that into something holy by saying that's what Shabbos is all about, shutting down everything so that I can commune exclusively with Hashem. Ki yadua shehu hamenucha veheder ha'avodah. Shabbat is ultimate peace, tranquility, and a cessation of work. Vehem shnei tzvot, and those therefore represent two extremes. Be'er Sheva represents the extreme of cessation of work. And what is the median point between the two of them? That's Yerushalayim and that's Hebron. So when we think about how each geographic location engenders a different trait or a different character trait, we know that. We know that from our personal experience. You go to South America, people are more spicy. You go to Canada, people are more cool, more chilled.
That's the exit. That's how they actually do just take it easy a little bit more.
But I'm saying the opposite. Hot-blooded Latin America, hot-blooded is what the Latino is because he's in a different climate. The Canadian is the more chilled and relaxed because every climate engenders a different quality within a person. We saw this in Rebbe Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari as well, that Eretz Yisrael is in a temperate climate, and therefore it engenders a temperate personality if one lives in the land that has a temperate climate. But Reb Tzadok is saying even more. Within the borders of Eretz Yisrael, the northernmost point represents one extreme, the southernmost point represents the other extreme, and Jerusalem is in the middle, which represents a combination of both. So now let's see how that translates into where Yitzchak is born. And this will make all the difference in the world. Was Sarah living in Hebron when Yitzchak was born? Or was she living in Beersheba when Yitzchak was born? And that's really the debate and why this discussion is a significant discussion. So we go back to the more modern text, which distills Reb Tzadok. He says, Yitzchak ikar midato hayita hayirah. What did Yitzchak represent? Yitzchak represents an absolute fear of God, a reverence for Hashem. And where is he born? So we'll see. Va'af shahavot klulim ze bazeh etzel Yitzchak, hayita midat ha'ava nisteret v'hayirah betokef. We know that all of our forefathers possessed a combination of both love of Hashem, that effusive, remember we talked last week about Avraham's effusiveness, his outgoing nature, his desire to love everybody. That was his attitude towards Hashem. And Yitzchak was more the withdrawn personality because of his fear of God. Okay, so keep that in mind. Hitkalaluto shel Avraham b'midato shel Yitzchak hi hamidah shenitchadsha ba'akedah k'mo shekosov b'dover tzedek. As one of the Holy Sfarim writes, Avraham fundamentally changed after the Akedah. He was no longer the same person. That was the 10th and final test that was given to Avraham. And in some way, through the Akedah, Avraham internalized the aspect that was Yitzchak. It wasn't just that he went through this life-altering situation and became a more God-fearing person, but his personality changed to the point where Yitzchak now became the master and Avraham transitioned to being the prior generation. Okay? I'm just skipping a little bit. V'hu nisayon ha'akedah, v'yadua b'zohar da'az itkalalu Avraham v'Yitzchak zeh bazeh. We know that at that moment, father and son mingled and merged with each other. V'yadua shemeyitzchak hu hatchalat to'ar ezrachi, shehu haya kadosh merechem v'leida. We know that a feature of Yitzchak Avinu is that he is the only one of our patriarchs who spent his entire life from birth to death in Eretz Yisrael. So he was pure from the womb. Avraham spent the first part of his life outside of Eretz Yisrael, mingling with idolaters. And Yaakov was born in Eretz Yisrael, but spent a large chunk of his life outside of Eretz Yisrael with idolaters, meaning his father-in-law Lavan. But Yitzchak is the only one who spends his entire life from the womb to the grave in Eretz Yisrael. Okay? And va'az gam Avram yitkalel bo v'nase ezrachi, v'nase Avram tafel Yitzchak. Through the Akedah, Avraham becomes merged with Yitzchak, and he becomes ancillary or secondary to Yitzchak. The Yitzchak ha'ikar, and Yitzchak now became the main patriarch after the Akedah. Ki minhu v'hala haya esek Avram b'midat ezrachi u'b'darga di Yitzchak, shelo nitnase klal b'shum nisayon. And that's the reason why Yitzchak was never subjected to tests. Avraham had to be tested because he had spent the first half of his life with heathens and had been adversely affected and that needed to be purged of that. Yitzchak was pure, and he never had to therefore go through any tests to purge him of the impurities. And that's also why from the Akedah and onwards, Avraham was not tested any further because he merged and was subservient to Yitzchak. So based on this, and we're getting to the punchline now, Efshar lomar shelefi hade'ah she'Avraham ba miBe'er Sheva, hainu ki me'az ha'akedah haya ikar isko shel Avraham b'midat ha'givura shel Yitzchak she'ikara b'Be'er Sheva. The opinion that suggests that Avraham came from Be'er Sheva is to tell us that Avraham had a complete conversion from Avraham to Yitzchak. Yitzchak is represented by Be'er Sheva, the land that is completely withdrawn and is like Shabbos. Okay? That's the midah of Yitzchak. He was not the effusive, outgoing person that his father Avraham was. So if we say that Avram is living in Be'er Sheva right after the Akedah, it means that he completely submitted himself to this attribute of Yitzchak, and that's why he was living in the place of Yitzchak, the place of complete Shabbat. V'ilu hade'ah soveret Shabbat mehar HaMoriah, soveret she'isko b'midat ha'gvura hayta kedei levarer et midat ha'ahava shelo u'leshachlila. But if you understand that he was in Chevron, or he was in Mount Moriah right after the Akedah, and did not go immediately to Be'er Sheva, it's because Avram understood that as a result of the Akedah, I meant to, to integrate my aspect of love and outgoingness with Yitzchak's aspect of reverence and inwardness, inward withdrawal, and to combine them together, which is what the city of Yerushalayim and the city of Hebron represent. A combination of those two midot together, of Avraham and Yitzchak together. Okay? Kedei levarer et midat ha'ahava shelo. Okay? V'lo birur shel midat ha'gevura mitzad atzmo shemidato sheyitzchak v'lo shel Avraham. He says, and it's not that to completely eliminate the Abrahamness of Abraham, but to integrate it and to temper it with Yitzchak. A combination of both Avram and Yitzchak is represented in the city of Jerusalem and the city of Hebron. Zohi midata shel Yerushalayim shemimazeget et shtei hamidot ke'echad. This is the trait of Jerusalem and of Hebron, that it combines both traits together. And that's the point that I wanted to make. There's more in this essay, but the point that I wanted to make is that sometimes when you look at the Torah and you see these seemingly mundane details, you're actually drawing a very important lesson. We have to be careful. Sometimes when we encounter an experience or a personality, whether it be a spouse or some other very strong person who may seek to completely change us, and we do change over the course of decades based on the person that we're married to, right? Wouldn't we all admit that through the influence of a spouse, we do change and we become sometimes a different person. We grow, and through experiences that we have in our raising children and other people in our lives, we do change. But the question is, what is my avodah? Am I meant to completely suppress who I was previously because now I'm in a new chapter of my life? Or am I meant to temper who I was previously and combine it with this new personality type that I find to be attractive? Like, I know this is the struggle that Baalei Tshuva have. But persons of Baal Tshuva, they struggle with this because on the one hand, they associate their previous life with something negative. I used to eat cheeseburgers. I used to go shopping on Shabbos. I used to do this and do that, and I'm not proud of that, and I want to put that all behind me. And sometimes you find the Baal Tshuva who will therefore go to the other extreme to completely eliminate their previous identity. But then you have the other Baal Tshuva who says, I loved my life before. I loved the Beatles, and I loved listening to music, and I loved art. I'm not prepared to get rid of it. I want to sanctify it. I want to make it something that's part of my now holy life. And I want to take the previous part of my life and integrate it with who I am today. So not to become Yitzchak altogether, the person who's very straight-laced and inwardly focused and is like the Shabbos Yid that we talked about last week, who doesn't want to have any disruptions at his Shabbos table or at his Pesach Seder, but rather I want to take my past, use the knowledge that I have from my past, and share it with others who I can be of influence to. I want to integrate the Yitzchak with the Avraham and not reject it entirely. Two different perspectives. Notice that there's this ambiguity in the text, whether Avraham came from Be'er Sheva to Beri Sarah, or whether he came from Har HaMoriah and Hebron to Beri Sarah. One opinion is he came from Be'er Sheva because he was totally Isaacized, if I can use that word. But the other opinion is that he came from the Jerusalem vicinity, because he was now prepared to integrate his past with his new personality, with his new being, a hybrid of Avraham and Yitzchak. That's something that all of us should sort of give some thought to. I think, who are we, and who do we want to be, and how do we relate to our past? All right. Any quick comments before we recess? Shlomi asks, if all life is unitary, where does mission in life come from? Does each neshama have its own mission, its own tafkid? Yeah, going back to the Kuzari, it's a very good question. Each person is considered to be a particle of a greater whole. There's no question about that. So it's not that everything is unitary in that everything has the same abilities and the same propensities and the same purpose, but everything is working towards that one unitary goal, which can only be accomplished sometimes when all of us are working towards that very same goal. So I don't think that it's necessarily a stira, necessarily a contradiction. Okay, let me wish you all a good week, and hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you.
And we'll see you Be'ezrat Hashem this week. Take care.
Thank you.